The Duke of Ashburn pushed open the iron garden gate of Carrington Hall without sending word ahead, expecting to find his oldest friend reading alone in the autumn light. He had ridden through the night from London with nothing but a satchel, a flask of cold tea, and the kind of grief a man stops trying to outrun after the second year. His coat was dust grey at the hem, his cravat loosened, his dark hair stiff with road wind, and his shoulders, broad enough that the gate hinges complained when his glove pushed it back, carried the heaviness of a long, quiet ride. The hinges sang their thin, metallic protest, and somewhere beyond the yew hedge a child laughed. A child. Alexander, the Duke of Ashburn, stopped on the gravel path with his hand still on the iron. He had visited Carrington Hall 6 times in the last 2 years. He had walked this path in May, with the lilac in bloom, in August, with the heat lying flat across the lawn, in February, when the box hedge was iron stiff with frost. And he had never, not once, heard a child laugh on this side of the gate. Henry Carrington had no children. Henry Carrington had no wife. Henry Carrington had taken the title at 26, refused every match the dowagers pushed at him, and built his life around horses, books, his orchard, and the friend whose grief he had carried like his own. The child laughed again. It was a short, surprised laugh, the kind small children give when something pleasing happens before they have thought about whether to be pleased. And it ended in a single bright sound that punched through Alexander's chest, as if a hand had reached behind his ribs and squeezed once. He took one step, another. The gravel sounded loud beneath his boots. Then the yew hedge ended, and he saw them. A woman sat on the low stone bench under the medlar tree, her back to him, in a gown of deep ruby wool buttoned to the throat against the October air. Her hair, chestnut, threaded with the bronze that autumn sunlight always found in it, was pinned simply at her nape with a wooden comb he could not see but knew because he had bought it in Bath for her 22nd birthday. A small girl, perhaps 3 years old, knelt on the grass at her knee in a saffron pinafore stained at the hem with crushed leaves, sorting acorns into a willow basket, with the seriousness of an archbishop counting alms. The woman lifted her face and laughed at something the child had said. Alexander did not move. He could not. His knees did not lock so much as forget how to do anything else. His mouth opened, and what came out was a word with no breath behind it. It was a name. It was the name he had buried 2 years ago, beside an empty coffin in a Suffolk churchyard, with the dean of the cathedral reading the lesson, and 300 mourners pretending not to watch him weep. The name reached the woman on the bench, who tilted her head a fraction at the sound of footsteps, and then turned, and looked at him with the polite, mild interest of a stranger. "Good afternoon," she said. Her voice was the same, lower pitched than people expected, warm at the edges, with the faint stutter of a smile in it. "Have you lost your way? My cousin's house is not easy to find from the upper road." "My cousin," she had said. The child looked up from the basket. She had Alexander's eyes, dark grey, very wide set, the lashes too long for her age, and a head of curls the same chestnut as her mother's. She studied him the way small children study men, openly, with no idea yet that staring was rude. Then she lifted one fat-knuckled hand and waved. "Hello," she said. Alexander made a sound. He had crossed battlefields. He had buried his father. He had sat at his wife's empty grave through one winter night while the parson begged him to come home. None of those things had prepared him for the sound the child made, or for the way the woman who was not, who could not be his wife, rose from the stone bench and walked toward him in a gown the color of pomegranate flesh, her hands folded politely in front of her, asking again whether he had lost his way. "Eleanor," he said finally, and his voice did not belong to him. She blinked. The name slid off her face without finding any purchase. She tilted her head again, smiled, and said, very gently, "I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage, sir." I'm Ellie. May I ask whom you have come to see? Behind her, from the open door of the south wing, a man stepped out into the late sun. Sir Henry Carrington was tall, fair-haired, with the kind of long-boned elegance that came of 3 generations of riding masters and chess players. He was in his shirt sleeves, which was unlike him. He carried a glass jar of damson preserves in one hand, which was unlike him also, and the smile he wore when he was 4 paces from the bench stilled on his face the moment he saw who stood at the edge of the gravel. The jar slipped a 1/4 inch in his grip. He caught it. He did not look down. "Alexander," he said. "Henry," said the Duke. The child stood up, brushing leaves from her pinafore, and ran on her short, determined legs across the grass toward Henry. Henry caught her, one-armed against his hip, without looking away from Alexander's face. The autumn air smelled of wood smoke and bruised apples and the meddler's last sweetness. And somewhere, a wood pigeon called. "Uncle Henry," the child said, with perfect proprietorial confidence. "This man knows Mamma's other name." Henry closed his eyes. It took Alexander 4 long strides to reach them. He stopped 1 pace short of the woman, close enough to see the small new freckle high on her cheekbone, the place near her left eyebrow where, 2 years and 4 months ago, a glass paperweight had struck her during the carriage accident and left a thin silver line he had kissed every morning for the 8 months she lay in fever. The scar was still there. The freckle was new. Her eyes, the grey-green he had married, held nothing of him. They held only the polite, expectant calm of a hostess who has not yet placed a guest. "Inside," said Henry, very quietly. "Both of you. Now." The study at Carrington Hall faced east and was therefore cold in the afternoon. A fire had been laid that morning, but not lit. Henry crossed to it now and crouched on the hearth with the deliberate slowness of a man who needed somewhere to put his hands. The damson jar he had carried in from the garden sat on the desk between them, unopened, a small, absurd witness to a conversation that was about to detonate. Alexander did not sit. He stood near the window, where he could see his wife, through the diamond panes, kneeling again in the grass with the child, showing her how to fit 1 acorn cup inside another. Alexander asked how long. The fire caught. Henry stayed crouched a moment longer than he needed to, then rose, brushed his palms on his thighs, and turned. His face had gone the color of cold parchment. 2 years and 3 months, he said. 2 years, Alexander repeated, and Henry corrected him gently on the 3 months, as if those 3 months mattered, as if every week of the count were a separate weight he had been carrying alone. Alexander said the obvious thing then, the thing about the funeral, the thing about the parish and the stone and the hymn. He said it almost without sound. Henry answered that they had buried an empty box together, that the river had taken her gown and the carriage and both horses and the coachman, and that there had been no body, and that there had never been a body, and that Alexander knew that. "I know that," said Alexander, and the words came out raw, because he had spoken them, in some private chamber of his head, every single morning for 2 years. Every coroner had said it, every constable, every well-meaning aunt. "There has never been a body. There has never been a body. Eleanor is at rest. Eleanor is in peace. Eleanor has crossed over." "She isn't," he said, and his voice cracked. "She isn't at rest. She has been in your house." Henry repeated, more softly, that she had been in his house. 2 years, he corrected, when Alexander said 3. The numbers passed between them, like coins set down on a desk that neither wanted to count again. Alexander asked at last, from when Henry had known. Henry's hands moved to the edge of the desk, long pianist's fingers, ink-stained from a morning's letters. He looked at them as if surprised they belonged to him. "I found her in November, Alexander, the year of the accident." November the 11th, after the first heavy snow. I was riding home from Tarrington Fair, the long way through Lower Burling, because the mare had thrown a shoe and I did not want to risk the high road in the wet. There is a village there called Burling Coombe. 18 houses, a church, a weaver, a blacksmith, a widow named Mrs. Rowe, who keeps a small, clean kitchen and takes in strangers when the parish requires it. He paused. He drew a breath that visibly cost him. Mrs. Rowe had taken in a woman the parish constable found on the riverbank in August. The woman had a head injury that had been stitched by a country surgeon. She had a fever that had broken twice and returned 3 times. She had been carried 5 miles downriver by the flood, lodged against a willow root, and pulled out by a boy looking for eels. Alexander did not turn from the window. The fire was working in earnest now. Behind the diamond panes, the woman in the pomegranate gown had taken the child's hand and was pointing out something in the upper branches of the medlar, a bird, perhaps, or a piece of weather. The light on her face was the light of a late October afternoon at 3 o'clock, and it was the same light that had lain on her face on a balcony at Ashbourne in the 2nd year of their marriage, when she had told him the doctor's news, and he had set his glass down on the stone railing and laughed for surprise. He remembered the laugh. He remembered the stone. He did not, for a long moment, remember how to breathe. Henry, who had been watching Alexander's shoulders and not his face, went on. He said that the woman at Mrs. Rowe's cottage had not known her name, had not known where she came from, had not known the year. Then he paused, made Alexander look at him, and said the thing he had not yet been able to say aloud in his own kitchen. That she had not known she was carrying a child. She had not been delivered yet. She had not. The child came in March at this house. I was there. The midwife was Mrs. Pollard from Stenning, who is discreet and has buried 3 of her own. Eleanor, Ellie, woke from the birth and did not remember the months before it. She believed the child was hers, because the baby was placed in her arms and rooted at her breast, and she has loved the child without question from the first moment. But she has never remembered carrying her. She does not know who fathered her. She does not know she was married. She does not know your face. And so for 2 years, said Alexander, and his voice was very, very quiet, you let me wear black. Henry did not answer. I named a charity after her, Henry. I built an almshouse. I commissioned a window in the chapel at Ashbourne with her face in the 2nd pane, and I sat under that window every Sunday for 2 winters, with my mother's hand on my arm. And I told myself that grief was the price of love. And all that while you were in this house, teaching my daughter to sort acorns. Henry only said yes. Alexander asked the single word that mattered, the why of it, and Henry's mouth opened, closed. He turned away to the fire and braced both hands on the mantel. Alexander, if you cannot sit, would you at least stop standing where you can see her? Because I cannot say any of this to your back, and I cannot say any of it to your face, and I cannot say it to a man watching her through a window. Sit, please. Alexander sat. He sat in the leather chair by the desk, which was the chair he had always sat in at Carrington Hall, on every visit, all those years they had been at Eton together and Oxford after. The chair Henry's father had crossed his legs in the night the 2 boys had been told they could go up to London together for the season. He sat in it now, like a man placed in a dock. Why? Henry turned. He did not let go of the mantle. Because I was afraid, he said, of what you would do if I told you. Alexander asked, then, whether Henry had thought he would have rejected her. Henry said no. He asked whether Henry had thought he would have left her here. Henry said no again, and then, with the half-step pause of a man choosing precision over speed, he said the longer answer. Alexander, no. I think you would have done the opposite. I think you would have ridden through the night the way you rode tonight. I think you would have arrived at this house within 48 hours of my letter, and you would have put your wife into your carriage, and you would have taken her back to Ashbourne, and you would have loved her. God help us all. You would have loved her, out of every kind of feeling except the one she needed. Alexander asked very quietly, "Which kind?" "Choice," Henry said. The fire spat. Henry passed his palm over his face. Henry began to explain it, in the slow, level voice of a man who had rehearsed the sentences in his own head for 2 years, and was speaking them aloud now for the first time. He said that she could not remember Alexander. She did not know she had been a duchess. She did not know what it had been to be courted by him, to choose him, to stand in the chapel at Ashbourne in his mother's lace and put her hand into his. She had been remade, by accident and slow water and one widow's kindness, into a woman who had chosen her own days for 2 years. If a stranger had come to this gate this afternoon and stood where you stood and named her, she would have looked at him as politely as she looked at you. And if that stranger had been a duke and had said the right words and offered the right protection and put a wedding ring back on her finger, she would have gone with him, out of duty, out of gratitude, out of confusion, out of the great weight of being told who she once was. Not out of love. Because love is a thing that requires the chooser to know what she is choosing. And your wife, Ellie, does not yet know. Alexander said, then, the harder version of the accusation, that Henry had decided this for her. Henry replied that he had decided to wait. 2 years, Alexander said, the count carrying its own indictment. Henry told him, in answer, that he had been waiting for her to remember, that he had always known Alexander would come, sooner or later, because Alexander visited him, and Beatrice was 3, and he could not have hidden her past 4. When Alexander came, Henry had wanted her to have already begun. And she had begun, he said, in the last 6 weeks. She dreams of a balcony. She dreams of a man's hand laid over hers on a railing. She woke last Tuesday and asked me whether she had ever owned a grey velvet riding habit, because she had dreamed of one. She had. You bought it for her in the 2nd year of your marriage. I never told her. She is coming back, Alexander. I did not want you to seize her before she had finished arriving. There was a long silence. Outside, the child was singing a tune with no words. The woman, who was the Duchess of Ashbourne, and did not know it, was laughing. The fire ate the 2nd log and asked for a 3rd. "And the child?" said Alexander at last. Henry's voice, when it came, was almost too quiet to hear. Beatrice was his, he said. Alexander answered, with the iron-edged calm that came of having spent the last hour ahead of himself, that he knew she was his, he had eyes, and that what he was asking was whether she knew him. Henry said no, but that she dreamed. Of what? Alexander asked. Of a man who smells like leather and rain. She has asked me 3 times in the last year why she has only 1 parent when the boys at the rectory have 2. I have told her, God forgive me, that her father is far away, that he was a soldier, that he travels, that he loves her very much. You told my daughter I was a soldier. It was the only lie I could tell that felt close enough to the truth not to poison her. Alexander's hand had been a fist for some minutes. He opened it now, slowly, and laid the palm flat on the desk between them, beside the damson jar, beside the inkwell, beside the small ivory letter opener his oldest friend had used to open the seal on the letter announcing his marriage 8 years ago this November. He said he should hate Henry. Henry said he knew. Alexander said it again, with the more terrible precision of a man making a forecast, that by tonight he would hate Henry with his whole life, and tomorrow he would hate him more, and the day after he did not know. Henry repeated that he knew. After a long silence, Alexander asked why Henry had not written him. Because I'm a coward, Alexander, and because I love your wife. There. It sat between them on the desk like a third object. Damson jar. Inkwell. The sentence Henry had not said in 12 years, and now had said in 5 words. Alexander did not look up. He looked at the jar. The light from the diamond panes caught its dark glass and put a slow purple inside it. "Since when?" he said. "Since the night you brought her into the assembly rooms in Brighton, the autumn before you proposed to her. Since the moment you turned away from the punch bowl and she was laughing at something the rector had said, and her hand was on your sleeve. That long. I never told her. I never told you. I never let her see it. I am telling you now because if I do not, you will think I kept her here for some lower reason, and you will leave with both of them tonight, and you will spend the rest of your life suspecting my house. I would rather have your hatred than your suspicion." Alexander stood. He crossed to the window again. The child was now sitting in her mother's lap. The mother was unpinning the comb from her own hair and putting it into the child's curls. The child was tilting her head with grave, queenly pride. Beyond them, the medlar leaves rattled in the small wind. "Get up," said Alexander. "I am up." "Then come outside with me." "Why?" "Because we are going to walk in the orchard until I can speak to her without breaking her. And you are going to walk 1 pace behind me, and you are going to keep your mouth shut, and you are going to learn that I have not, in fact, decided yet whether to hate you." Henry breathed out. It was the first breath he had taken in 20 minutes. "Alexander, don't walk." The orchard at Carrington Hall ran east in 3 long rows of espaliered pear and a back row of cider apples. The grass between the rows had been scythed in September and was now growing back in soft, ankle-high tufts. The October sun lay slantwise across the trunks. A robin worked the upper branches of the third pair. The 2 men walked in silence for the length of the first row, Alexander a half-pace ahead, Henry exactly where he had been told to be. And at the end of the row, Alexander stopped. Alexander said it like a fact set down on a table, that she was happy. And Henry, falling in beside him, agreed with the same 2 words. Alexander said the next thing more carefully, that Henry had not touched her. It was not a question, but Henry answered it. "I have not touched her, Alexander. Not as a man touches a woman. I have carried her child upstairs when the child was a fever baby. I have caught her elbow on the icy stair. I have put my shoulder under her arm when her ankle turned in July. I have brushed her hair from her face twice. Once when she was weeping in her sleep, and woke calling a name I could not make out. And once when she fell asleep at the kitchen table in February over a bowl of porridge. That is the inventory of my hands in 2 years. There has been no more." Alexander asked the same one-word question he had used in the study. "Why?" "Because she was his wife," Henry said. Alexander pointed out that she did not know that. Henry answered, with the soft flatness of a man stating an old internal fact, that he knew that. Alexander offered the alternative, that Henry could have told her she was a widow. Henry said he could not. "You could have told her she was the orphan of a Suffolk parson with no people in the world, and that you had been engaged to her in the spring, and that her memory had been lost in a fall from a horse. You could have invented any history that closed every door behind her, including the one to Ashbourne, and you could have walked into that closed garden behind her and become her husband within a year. No one in this county would have asked a single question. The child would have been your child. She would have been your wife. She is 28 years old, Henry. She would have loved you back. Why didn't you do it?" Henry's voice, when it came, was not the voice of the man in the study. It was older and quieter, and it had the small dry rasp of a man trying to speak across a great inner distance. Henry told him, then, what he had not told anyone. He told it not in any rehearsed order, but in the order it came to him as they walked, half a pace apart on the orchard grass. He said that every morning, when she came down the stairs in the gown his sister had altered for her, and he looked at her face and saw that she did not know him, he had to remind himself that not knowing him was a different thing from belonging to him. He was 31. He had wanted her for 9 of those years. He had been alone in a house with her for 2. If he had wished to take her, he had every condition a man could wish for: her gratitude, her dependence, her trust, the absence of the husband she did not remember, and the silence of the entire parish, who took her for his widowed cousin from Northumberland. He had had all of it. And every morning I made the same private decision, which is that I would rather be the man who did not take her than the man who did. I made it again last night. I will make it again tomorrow. I did not need her to remember you to make that decision. I needed myself to remember you. Alexander did not answer. He had stopped walking. He had laid his palm flat against the trunk of the second pear and was staring upward into the late leaves, with his throat working. He said, after a while, that he should still hate Henry, and Henry agreed. He said he might still, and Henry agreed to that as well. They stood under the second pear for a long minute, with nothing more passing between them than the small sound of the wind moving the upper leaves and the low scratch of the robin on a higher branch. Then Alexander asked his oldest friend why he had not written last spring, because in March she dreamed of you for the first time, and I thought, God forgive me, that if I waited a little longer, the next time she opened the door to your face, it would be her own face that opened, not the face of a polite stranger. I thought I could give her back to you whole, or as whole as she was going to be. I was wrong to wait this long. I knew I was wrong 6 weeks ago. I had a letter half written on my desk when you walked through the gate this afternoon. I will show it to you. It is dated last Wednesday. Show me tonight. Yes. They walked the rest of the orchard in silence. At the far end, where the cider row met the kitchen garden, they turned and started back. Halfway down the second row, Alexander said, without turning his head, "Tell me about the child." Henry told him, walking, about the child. She was his in every way that had nothing to do with kinship lines, he said. She was grave. She was bossy. She had Alexander's jaw. She woke at 5:30, regardless of what hour she was put to bed. She loved apples. She was terrified of geese. She had named the smallest pony in the home paddock Lord Fitzwarren, and she addressed it as "My Lord" before every carrot. She spoke to the gardener as if he were a senior cabinet minister. Henry slowed his pace. He passed a hand along the bark of the pear they were level with, found a small dry knot, and put his thumb against it as a man might press a coin into a wound to remind himself it was there. She has. Alexander, this is the part I have been afraid to tell you, because it has cost me. She has, since she was old enough to asked at bedtime for her papa. Not for any specific man, for a papa, the way some children ask for a song. She has asked it every night. Every night. I have lied every night. I have told her that her papa is in a place where it is hard to write letters, and that he loves her, and that he is coming. She believes me without trouble, because Eleanor has never contradicted me. Eleanor cannot contradict me. She does not know the answer. Alexander repeated the words back to himself, that the child had asked every night, every single night, for 2 years. Henry only nodded. The number sat in the orchard air between them like a third small body neither could lift. Alexander stopped at the foot of the orchard and put his hand over his mouth. The wood pigeon called again. Somewhere in the kitchen, a copper pan was being scoured. The Duke of Ashburn, who had carried out the last rites for his wife at 29 and assumed himself widowed for the rest of his natural life, stood under the last pear tree of Carrington Hall, and made a sound that was not quite a sob, but was related to one. Henry, 2 paces behind him, did not move. After a long while, Alexander wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand, very briskly, and said, "Take me to her." Eleanor was no longer on the bench. She had taken the child indoors when the afternoon began to cool, and she met them in the small east parlour with the curtains drawn back and a tray of tea set on the low table between 2 settles. The child was on the rug at her feet, organizing her acorns by some private taxonomy of size and shine. The fire was burning. The pomegranate gown looked deeper in the lamplight than it had outdoors, and the wooden comb was back in Eleanor's hair, though one curl had escaped and was lying along her neck the way it had always lain, the way Alexander remembered, the way he had once thought he would never see again outside of memory. She rose when they came in. She did not curtsy. She was the mistress of the room, as far as she knew. But she inclined her head with the easy grace of a woman who liked her guest, and had been told he was important. "My cousin tells me you have known me before," she said, with perfect candour, "and that I did not know it. I am sorry, sir. The fault is entirely mine." It was an absurd sentence. It was the most courteous thing she could have said. It was the sentence of a hostess apologizing for a soup that had been over-seasoned. It was so exactly like her, so precisely the cadence of the woman who had once apologized to a king for stepping on his shoe at a presentation, that Alexander had to look briefly at the ceiling. "There is no fault," he said. "My cousin tells me also that you and he have been close all your lives, and that you have traveled some distance, and that you would like to stay for several days. Of course you must stay. I have asked Mrs. Druitt to make up the south room. Henry says it is the room you usually sleep in. It will be aired by supper." "Thank you, Lady Ellie. Just Ellie, please. We are very informal here. My cousin will not have it otherwise." The child at her feet looked up. "Are you the soldier?" she asked. She had the same lower-pitched voice as her mother, but it came in the bright, decided pitch of a 3-year-old. "Uncle Henry said you were." Eleanor put a hand on top of the child's head, briefly, the way a mother does to slow a question without stopping it. "Beatrice. He said Papa was a soldier." "He did, yes." "Sir, are you a soldier?" Alexander, who had until that moment been holding himself together by a rope of pure breath, knelt on the rug. He moved slowly, the way one moves toward a deer. He stopped 2 arms' lengths from the child. He held out one large, weather-darkened hand, palm up, the way he had been taught as a boy to greet a dog he did not know. "I was a soldier," he said gravely. "A very long time ago. I am not one anymore. I am a duke, which is duller. May I see what you are sorting?" Beatrice considered him. She considered the hand. She considered the question. Then, with the solemn dignity of a steward presenting plate, she placed 3 acorns in his palm, 1 small, 1 middle, 1 large, and announced, "These are the king ones." The king ones. "These 3. They are the biggest. The next ones are the lord ones, then the cousin ones, then the maid ones. The very small ones I do not name. They have not earned it." Alexander closed his hand around the 3 royal acorns and pressed them, very briefly, against his lips. Beatrice watched this gesture with grave approval, as though it were an established court custom of which she had been informed, and which had now been satisfactorily performed by a foreign dignitary. Then she went back to her basket. Over the child's head, Eleanor was watching the Duke. Her face had not changed. It was still polite, still warm, still the face of a hostess. But her eyes had moved, very slightly, almost imperceptibly, and had fixed on the line of his jaw, on the way his hand had closed around the acorns, on the small, soundless way he had pressed them to his mouth. She did not understand what she was seeing. She did not, yet, recognize him. But for the first time since the gate had opened, Something in her face was working. She looked away. She poured tea. She handed him a cup. The cup chinked, very faintly, against the saucer in her hand. It chinked because her hand had, for 1 second, no longer, trembled. He saw it. Henry saw it. The child did not see it. She asked if he took sugar. He declined. She asked about milk. He declined that too. She observed, with the small, unhurried frown of a hostess making a note, that he took it plain. He told her he always had. Most men did not, she said. He answered, very simply, that he was not most men. She looked up at him then, fully, with the cup half offered, and for a long second the parlour held its breath. Outside, the wind moved in the medlar. The fire turned a log. Beatrice, on the rug, hummed a private tune. Eleanor's grey-green eyes searched his face, not for a name, not for a memory, but for the answer to some smaller, more urgent question her body had begun to ask before her mind could phrase it. Whatever the question was, she did not find the answer. She blinked. She gave him the cup. She smiled. "Welcome to Carrington Hall, sir." "Thank you, Lady Ellie." "Just Ellie." Ellie. That night, the south room of Carrington Hall had been aired and warmed and laid with the heavy linen of the house, and the Duke of Ashbourne did not sleep in it. He sat in the window seat with his coat off and his cravat undone, and a single tallow candle on the sill, and he watched the moon rise over the kitchen garden until the small hours, when he heard a floorboard creak in the corridor outside his door. He opened the door. Henry was in the corridor, in a dressing gown of plain dark wool, holding a candle of his own. Alexander told him he should be in bed. Henry said the same of Alexander. Neither, when pressed, could manage it. They stood in the corridor a long time. Neither moved. Eventually Henry said, "I have the letter on my desk, the one I was writing. Would you like to read it now?" "Tomorrow." "Tomorrow, then." Alexander asked, very quietly, how she took her tea. "Plain," Henry said, "like you." He asked how she slept, and Henry told him, on her left side, with her hand under her cheek, since the first night under this roof. She had done it before, Alexander said, and Henry nodded. Henry added, more for the sake of having something else to give, that there was a draught from her window in winter, that he had meant to have the casing redone, and that she would not let him bother, because she liked the cold. "She always did," Alexander said. They stood another moment in the candle-soft dark. Then Henry asked, plainly, what he intended to do tomorrow. Alexander looked past Henry's shoulder, into the deeper dark of the corridor, where the door to the nursery stood half open, and where, behind it, somewhere, the small, even breathing of a sleeping child was happening. Because 2 years ago, Henry Carrington had taken a country road home. "Tomorrow," said the Duke, "I am going to learn to be patient. I have not been good at it. You will tell me when I am about to do something stupid." "I always have." They wished each other good night, very quietly, in the way men do when they have spoken plainly for the first time in years, and have nothing left to add. The candles withdrew in opposite directions down the corridor. In the morning, the Duke of Ashbourne came down to breakfast in a clean shirt borrowed from his host, and found his daughter already at the table, kneeling on a turned-down chair to reach her bowl. She regarded him over a spoonful of porridge with the gravity of a magistrate. She observed, in the magisterial way of small children, that he had stayed. He confirmed that he had. She asked how long. "Some days yet," he told her. "Some days yet, if her mother and her uncle would have him." "Mamma said you may stay until the medlars are over." "The medlars are not over for 10 days, so you have 10 days, unless you ask for more, and she says you may ask for more." "That is a great kindness." "Yes," agreed Beatrice. "Mamma is kind. I am also kind, but only sometimes. Uncle Henry says I am still learning." Alexander sat down across from her. He drew the toast rack toward him. He spread butter on a slice, with the careful concentration of a man performing surgery, and said, in the voice he had used at 24 in his first speech in Parliament. He addressed her formally, Lady Beatrice, and asked if he might put a question to her. She granted permission with a small lift of the spoon. He asked, then, what kind of man her papa was. Beatrice considered. Her spoon hovered. The porridge, briefly forgotten, gave off its small, clean steam between them. He smells like leather, she said, and like rain. He is bigger than Uncle Henry. He sings the song about the brown owl, but he sings it wrong, on purpose, to make me laugh. He has a horse called Saturn. He puts his hand on the back of my neck when I am cross, and the cross goes away. He is far away because he is being a soldier for the king. He will come home. He has told me he will come home. He told me in a dream. Alexander, who had stopped buttering, set down the butter dish. Alexander asked, very quietly, when this papa had told her so. The night before last, she said. He repeated the words back to himself, as though needing them again in his own voice. I dreamt he was at the gate. He had a coat the colour of the path. He had no hat. He looked at me like he was very surprised, but he was not cross. And then I waked up, and you were at the gate. She returned her attention to the porridge. The spoon went back in. The conversation, for her, was finished. Alexander sat with the butter dish in his hand and the morning light on his face, and looked at his daughter, and thought with perfect clarity, I will not survive this. Eleanor came in then. She was in a different gown, the same cut, but in the deep colour of stewed quince, which on her hair made the bronze come out. She had pinned the wooden comb again. She paused for half a second at the door, half a second, no more, when she saw the Duke at her table, and the small pause was not the pause of a hostess. It was the pause of a body that had been told to expect a particular shape in a chair, and had been startled to find that the shape was already there. She covered it instantly with a smile, and an apology for being late, and a request for tea, and a comment on the weather. But the half-second had happened, and Henry, coming in behind her, met Alexander's eye briefly across the sideboard, and looked away. That was the first morning. By the third morning, Alexander had learned several things. He had learned that Eleanor took her tea on the south terrace at 10:30, with a book in her lap that she frequently did not open. He had learned that she walked the orchard at 4 in the afternoon, if the weather permitted, and the long gallery, if it did not. He had learned that she slept badly. He had learned this from Mrs. Druitt, the housekeeper, who in a low voice, while pressing a clean shirt for him in the laundry, had told him that her ladyship, Mrs. Druitt did not call her Miss Ellie, woke often, and dreamed often, and twice in the last month had been heard, in the small hours, speaking to someone who was not in the room. Alexander asked what her ladyship had been speaking. Names, Mrs. Druitt said. He asked whose. Once, she told him, a name she had not caught. Once, his own. Alexander stood still while Mrs. Druitt laid the shirt over the press. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, How long have you known, Mrs. Druitt? Sir, I have known since the first week. I held her at her labour. I knew the lace on the gown she came in. It was Brussels work. There is one warehouse in London that imports it, and the Duke of Ashbourne's house has been a client of it since before my father was alive. I made the master's bed the morning of her wedding. I do not forget a face. Sir Henry told me not to write. I did not write. I obeyed him because I love him, and because I loved the lady before I loved him, and because I have watched what he has done in this house and what he has not done, and I judged him. He passed, so I passed too. I am old enough to have made my own decision, sir. He told her she was old enough to have made her own decision, and that she had made the right one. She added, briskly, that he was not to dismiss her. He answered that he would not dare. Mrs. Druitt, who was 64 years old and shaped like a small barrel, looked up from the press and met the Duke's eye with the dry, unflinching look of a woman who had once told the late Queen that her cook was robbing her. "Sir, I will give her ladyship back to you as soon as her ladyship is ready, not 1 day before. Are we agreed?" "We are agreed." "Good. Your shirt is done." He had also learned that his wife was beginning to notice him. It was not a thing she did with her face. Her face was still the face of a polite hostess. It was a thing she did with her body. When he passed her in the corridor, she paused, half a beat, before she went on. When he laid his hand on the back of a chair near her at dinner, she shifted in her own chair, very slightly, the way a horse shifts when a familiar weight settles in its saddle. When the child had cried in the night, and he had gone to her, Henry had given him this, and had carried her on his shoulder along the gallery until she slept, Eleanor had come out of her room in a plain white nightgown, with a shawl pulled across her shoulders, and had stopped at the head of the stairs, and watched, and had not said anything, and had gone back inside. But in the morning she had been pale. By the 5th morning, she said his name without his title. It happened at breakfast. He had asked her to pass the butter. She had passed it, and as he took it, she had said, low, "Here, Alexander." And then her face had gone white, and the dish had clinked against his fingers, and she had looked at Henry across the table, with the helpless, astonished look of a person who had felt a stranger's hand in their pocket. Henry had laid his palm flat on the cloth, as one does to a frightened animal, and had said only, "It is all right, Ellie. He is a friend." Eleanor had nodded. She had finished her tea. She had gone to walk in the orchard. Alexander followed her, an hour later, at a distance. She knew he was behind her. She did not look back, but her walk slowed when his step caught up, and she stopped under the 3rd pear tree of the 2nd row, exactly where he had stopped on the 1st afternoon, and laid her gloved hand against the bark. "I do not know your name," she said. "I know your name. I do not know how I know it." He told her, very quietly, that she had known it before. She repeated the phrase back to herself, the way a person learning a foreign sentence repeats it once aloud to be sure of the sound. Then he said her old name. Eleanor. She turned then. Her eyes were wet, but only at the corners, and they did not spill. She did not seem to know they were wet. "That is the other name," she said. "Mrs. Druitt uses it when she is angry with me about a window. Sir Henry has never used it. You called me by it in the gate." "You were called by it for 26 years. "By whom?" "By me. By your father. By your mother. By the dean of the cathedral at Lichfield who baptized you. By the village children at Ashbourne who called you my lady because they had been told to, and not because they knew what a duchess was. By the man whose horse threw you, an apprentice carter on the Bristol road called Tim Loomis, who has been forgiven and is now married and has 2 children of his own. By many, many people. By me most of all. Eleanor." She said his name. He answered. After a moment, looking at the bark and not at him, she asked what she had been to him. He did not move toward her. He had a soldier's discipline about him, and a husband's older, harder discipline beneath that. "You were the woman I married 8 years ago this November in the chapel at Ashbourne, in my mother's lace, with 300 people standing, and the rector reading the lesson about the woman of valor, and the village band playing badly in the porch. You were the woman who fell with child in our 5th year, and rode to Bath to see her aunt in our 7th, and was thrown into a river when her carriage struck a milestone in flood, and was lost to me, I thought, on the 11th of August 2 years ago. You were the love of my life. You are the love of my life. I have not learned how to be the Duke of Ashbourne without you, and I have been pretending for 2 years to know how, and I am not good at it." Eleanor did not speak. She was looking at his face the way a person looks at the surface of a pond when they are trying to see down. The orchard was very still. The robin from the first day was working a higher branch. Somewhere by the house, Beatrice was being told to put on her boots. She said his name once more, and he answered. And then she said the small, ordinary sentence that broke the spell. She needed to sit down. He moved then. He moved very carefully. He took her elbow, and he walked her to the low wall at the end of the orchard row, and he sat her on it, and he stood 3 paces away with his hands behind his back. Because to stand any nearer would have been to ask of her what he had no right to ask. She sat on the wall in her quince-coloured gown, with her hands folded in her lap, and she breathed for a long time. "I am dreaming you," she said. "Tell me." "I am dreaming you. I have been dreaming you for some weeks. I did not know it was you. I knew it was a man. He had your shoulders. He had your hand. He laid his hand over mine on a stone railing in a place that smelled of lilac, and he said something I could not quite hear, and I leaned my head against his shoulder, and I did not know that man, and I loved him in the dream. I have not loved a man in a dream before. I have not, Alexander. I have not loved any man at all that I can remember. Until now I have only loved Henry's house, and Henry's kindness, and my child, and the medlar tree. You loved me. You loved me very much. You were not... I do not want you to think you were a meek wife, Eleanor. You were not afraid of me. You quarrelled with me. You quarrelled with me about the staff, and the tenants, and the politics in the upper house. You called me an oaf in front of the Prime Minister once. You laughed at me in your own bedroom. You laid your head on my shoulder when I had failed at something and made the failure smaller. We were not perfect. We were married. I had thought, God forgive me, I had thought I would never have any of it again. She said the obvious thing then, in 2 short sentences, that Henry had kept her here, and that Henry had known. He gave her back the same words, only with the verbs softened, because she needed to hear them confirmed in another voice before she could go on. After a moment, she asked the harder question. Why had Henry not told him? He thought about how to answer. The robin moved. He decided on the simplest truth. He was afraid I would take you home before you were a person who could choose to come. She thought about this for a long time. She turned her face up to the slanting October sun. She closed her eyes. The light moved across the new freckle on her cheekbone, and the old silver scar above her left eyebrow, and the chestnut at her temple where the bronze caught. He was right, she said, very quietly. Alexander did not answer. There was nothing he could say to that which would not undo 2 days of patience. She opened her eyes. I do not yet remember you, Alexander. I know. I may remember you. I may not. The country surgeon at Burling-Combe told Mrs. Rowe that some heads come back and some do not, and that mine, in his opinion, would come back if it ever did at all, but slowly and unevenly, and not on any schedule. I have been waiting for a year to remember a single thing that mattered. I have remembered the taste of a marzipan fruit I used to be given at Christmas. I have remembered that I did not like geese. I have not remembered who I was. I am not sure I will remember who I was. It does not matter. It does matter. It matters to you. It matters less than you do. Eleanor, Ellie, I would rather have you as you are, in a borrowed orchard, in my friend's quince-coloured gown, with no memory of our wedding, than have my memory of you and not have you. I have lived for 2 years with the memory of you. The memory is not enough. She looked at him for a long time. Then she did the thing he had not dared to imagine. She lifted one gloved hand and laid it, palm down, on her own knee, and she said, Sit. He sat. He sat on the low orchard wall beside his wife, and he did not touch her, and after a while she rested her gloved fingers very lightly on top of his bare hand, the way a woman rests her hand on the rim of a cup she is not yet ready to lift. They sat that way, until the bell at the back of the house rang for the children's dinner, and Beatrice's voice came floating from the kitchen garden in great indignation about a goose, and Eleanor laughed. A sudden, small laugh that came up out of her chest as if it had been waiting, and lifted her hand, and stood, and walked back up the orchard row to her daughter, and did not turn round. Alexander remained on the wall a long time. It rained in the night. It rained the way it rains in Sussex in late October, which is to say, slowly at first, in fits, with the wind coming up after midnight and the chimneys complaining, and the house finding its small leaks one by one. Alexander, who had slept perhaps 3 hours, was woken at 2 in the morning by a small wet patch on his pillow that proved, on inspection, to be a slow drip from a corner of the ceiling near the casement. He cursed once, quietly, moved the pillow, set the basin from the washstand under the drip, and was reaching for his coat to go and find a candle when he heard, somewhere along the corridor, a soft thump and a child's high, frightened voice. He was at the nursery door in 7 strides. Beatrice was sitting up in her cot in a small pool of lamplight, with the wet patch on the wall behind her, where a much larger leak was running freely down the plaster onto the bedclothes. Her hair was a wild halo of curls. Her nightgown was soaked to the shoulder. She was not crying. She was furious. "It is raining," she said, with enormous outrage. "On me!" "It is raining on you," Alexander agreed, gravely, and lifted her out of the cot, wrapped in the dry corner of her own blanket. She locked her arms around his neck without hesitation, exactly the way a child grips the only adult in the room when there are no others available, and pressed her wet cheek against his clean shirt. She smelled of milk and lamp oil, and the lavender water Mrs. Druitt used in the children's linen. "Mamma's room is dry," she informed him, into his collar. "Then we shall go to Mamma's room." He carried her down the gallery. Behind him, in the nursery, a second slow drip began. He would deal with it later. He stopped at the door of Eleanor's room and knocked once, with his knuckle, very softly, and Eleanor opened the door at once. She was already up. She was in her white nightgown with the shawl across her shoulders. She had a candle. She had been, by the look of her, waiting. She said only, "Bring her in," and stepped back from the door. Her room was small. It had a single window facing east. The bed was narrow. The fire had been laid but not lit. Alexander set Beatrice on the bed. Eleanor knelt at the hearth and lit the fire from her candle with practiced speed, in the way of a woman who has slept in a country house for 2 winters and knows that fires must be coaxed, not commanded. She rose, took the wet nightgown off the child, wrapped Beatrice in a dry flannel from the chest by the bed, set her in the center of the eiderdown, and only then turned to Alexander. "There is a leak in the nursery," he said. "There is a leak in the nursery in October every year. The roofers will not come because there has been a slate gone since August, and Henry has not had it replaced because the man with the slate is in Lewis and is unwell. I have asked him 3 times. I will ask him a 4th tomorrow. Until then, you and I and Henry will go up into the attic and put a bucket where the bucket must go." "You will not. You will stay here with the child." "I will stay here with the child," Eleanor agreed, and did not argue. She was practical. She had always been practical. He had forgotten how practical she had been. The memory of her practicality came back to him in that small, firelit room as sharply as the memory of her face. She had been a duchess, but she had been raised by a country parson, and she had known how to fix a roof. He went to wake Henry. Henry was already awake. He met Alexander in the corridor in his shirt sleeves, with a horn lantern and a coil of cord. They went up the back stair to the attic together and stood in the cold, dark space among the trunks and the rafters and looked up at the place where, between the 2nd and 3rd truss, the wind had got under a slate and the rain was coming in along the timber in a slow, long, bright line that fell, when the eye followed it, exactly over the nursery ceiling. "I will get the slate," said Henry, and was halfway down the attic ladder before Alexander caught him by the shoulder. Henry? Yes? It is raining, and it is dark, and you will fall off the roof. It is one slate. It is one slate at 2:30 in the morning in October in the dark. We will set a sheet of tarred canvas over the place from the inside, and we will weight it with the iron, and we will fix the slate in the morning when there is light. Sit down. I will not sit down. I am the master of this house. You are the master of this house. You are not the only person in it. Sit down. Henry sat down on a trunk. He sat for the time it took Alexander to find the canvas, which was where he had remembered it being from a previous summer's repair, and to drag it out, and to spread it under the leak, and to weight the corners with the cast iron flat iron from beside the chimney, and a small ship's anvil that should not, in fact, have been in the attic of a Sussex country house, but was. They worked side by side. They did not speak. They did the thing in 20 minutes, by lantern light, on their knees, in the dust. When they were done, and they sat on a beam together to breathe, Henry said, I should have written you in March. You should have written me in November. I know. You should have written me at the funeral, Henry. You should have ridden to the funeral at Ashbourne, and walked into the chapel, and dragged me out of my own pew, and put me in a chaise, and brought me here. I had no certainty in November. The surgeon thought she would not last the week. He had thought it twice. The fever had returned. I sat with her 3 nights running. I have never told you any of this. I sat with her, with Mrs. Rowe asleep in the chair by the hearth, and I held a glass of water to her mouth in the dark, and I told her things I have never told anyone. He drew a breath. The lantern light pooled around his hands. I told her, Alexander, listen. I told her that if she lived, I would write to her husband by morning. I made that promise to her in the dark, in November, while she could not hear me. And then the fever broke at dawn, and she opened her eyes, and she did not know her own name. And He stopped. His face was very white in the lantern. I broke the promise. I broke it the moment she opened her eyes, because I looked at her and I saw that she did not know herself, and I thought, you cannot send a woman who does not know herself in a coach to a husband whose name she does not recognize. The rain on the canvas above them seemed, for a moment, to grow louder, and then to settle again. I told myself I would write next week. And next week she did not know herself either. And next week, and next week, and a month, and a season, and a year, and another year. I have broken that promise every morning, Alexander. I broke it again this morning. The lantern swung very slowly on its hook. The rain fell on the canvas above them with a soft drumming sound. You broke it for a reason. I broke it for 2 reasons. One of them was kindness. One of them was not. Yes. You should hit me. I will not hit you. You should. If I were going to hit you, I would have done it on the gravel path. I would have done it in the study. I would have done it in the orchard. I have not hit you. I will not hit you. Henry. Henry, look at me. Henry, with great effort, looked at him. You did one thing right, said Alexander. You did not touch her. You did not touch her, and you let her become a woman who has dreams again. And tonight, you and I are sitting in your attic in our shirt sleeves, fixing the leak over my daughter's bed. I do not forgive you yet. I may forgive you. I have not decided. But sit there. Breathe. We will go down in a minute. There are women in this house, and the women in this house need both of us to be useful by morning. Henry breathed. The rain steadied, then quieted. After a while they climbed back down the attic ladder. In the corridor, the door of Eleanor's room stood half open. The fire was high. The child was asleep, curled against her mother's side, and Eleanor herself was sitting upright in the bed, with her shawl across her shoulders, and her eyes closed, dozing. the small, even breathing of mother and daughter rising and falling together, as if they had practiced it. Alexander stopped in the doorway. He did not go in. He looked at them for a long moment, and then he looked at Henry, and then he turned and went back to the south room and closed his own door. And he sat for the rest of the night in the window seat, looking out at the small, grey beginnings of dawn over the kitchen garden. And somewhere between 4 and 5 o'clock, he understood that he had begun, against his will, against his anger, against every code of his upbringing, to forgive his oldest friend. The next day, Eleanor remembered her wedding dress. It happened in the linen press. She had gone up after breakfast to look for a shawl for Beatrice, who had complained that the green one scratched, and she had opened the third drawer of the press and pulled out a folded length of cream silk that Henry's sister had sent down 2 winters before for cushions and had not yet been cut. The silk was a heavy cream, and as Eleanor laid it across her arm to see if the colour would suit Beatrice, she stopped. She stood very still. She lifted the silk to her cheek. She closed her eyes. She said, almost inaudibly, "There was Brussels lace on the cuffs." Mrs. Druitt, who happened to be passing the door, stopped also, and very quietly went on. Henry, downstairs in the library, did not know it had happened. Alexander, in the south room writing a letter to his land agent, did not know either. Only Eleanor and the silk and the dust of the linen press knew. Then Eleanor put the silk back. She closed the drawer. She found Beatrice's other shawl. She went down to breakfast as if nothing had happened. At luncheon, she said, in a quiet voice that made Henry put down his glass, "Did I have a gown with Brussels lace on the cuffs once?" Henry said that she had. She named the occasion. At her wedding. He repeated the words back. She added, half a beat later, the other half of the answer, to Alexander. He repeated that, too, very quietly, like a man confirming an entry in a parish book. She looked across the table at the Duke. She did not smile. She did not weep. She regarded him for a long moment with an expression Alexander had never seen on her face in his life. Neither the polite hostess of the first afternoon, nor the troubled dreamer of the orchard wall, but a person who had remembered, just then, that she had been a particular shape in the world, and was beginning to take that shape again. "Alexander?" "Yes." She said, almost to herself, that she had been happy in that dress. Alexander confirmed it. She added, after a moment, that she had been happy in the chapel and at the dinner after. He confirmed that, too. Every small fact she offered up to him, the way one confirms a list to a person who is testing a door in the dark. She had sung in the carriage on the way to the wedding journey, she said. He repeated the whole sentence back to her, because she seemed to need the assurance of the words coming from his mouth, as well as her own. She asked, then, what she had sung. "You sang a song called The Yellow Heart of June," he said, and his voice was even though his eyes were not. "You sang it because you had been singing it all summer, and because your father had taught it to you when you were small, and because your mother had laughed at you for singing it in church the Sunday before, and you said it was the only song you knew that suited a wedding. You sang it badly. I made you sing it again." Eleanor was very still. She looked at her plate. She looked at the Duke. She looked at Henry. She set down her fork. "I am tired," she said. "Forgive me. I shall lie down." She rose. She left the dining room. Halfway down the corridor she turned, and came back to the doorway and said, very quickly, without coming in, "Alexander." "Yes?" She said it as though offering proof of something she had not known she possessed, that Beatrice's middle name was Anne. He gave the sentence back to her, the same words, the same order. She added that it was after his mother. He said yes, after his mother. She said, with the smallest possible lift of the chin, that this was what he would have wanted. He told her that this was what they had agreed, the two of them, before the child was born. Eleanor put both palms flat against the door jamb for one breath. Then she pushed off it and walked away, and they heard her bedroom door close, very softly, at the top of the stair. Henry, across the table from Alexander, said nothing for a long minute. Then he said only that she was coming back. Alexander agreed. Faster than he had thought, Henry added. Faster than he had hoped, Alexander corrected him, with the rueful precision of a man who had been counting days against his will and had stopped pretending that he was not. After a long pause, Henry told him to take her home. Soon. Not yet, but soon. Alexander said he would. 3 more days. In those 3 days, Eleanor took the Duke walking in the kitchen garden, where the late bees were being trained on poles, and she told him things about her life at Carrington that were small and exact, and that he stored in himself, like a man storing supplies in a cellar before a winter. She liked the brown hen called Constance more than the speckled one called Lavinia. She did not like the rector's wife at Stenning, who pitied her too obviously. She had taught Beatrice to count to 10 in French, badly. She had not been able to look at a river for the first 6 months. She now could. She had ridden once, in May, on the smallest of Henry's mares, and had felt, for one strange instant, that her body remembered how to ride better than she did, and she had been frightened by the memory, and had not ridden since. She told him she had thought, until a week ago, that the dreams of the stone railing meant nothing. She told him she now thought they had meant Ashbourne. She told him she did not yet know whether she wanted to see Ashbourne. She told him she would write to him about it. She told him then, not laughing, that of course she did not need to write to him about it, because he was at her dining table, and that the habit of writing instead of speaking was a habit she had developed because for 2 years she had had no one to speak to except her cousin and her child. She told him she did not yet know how to be a person who spoke to a husband. He did not press her. On the evening of the 3rd day, Henry was called to a tenant farm where a barn roof had come down in the rain and a brood mare needed attention. He went out at 6. He left, on the dining table, his half-written letter, the one he had told Alexander about, folded under the pewter inkstand, with a note on the top in his sloping hand. For Alexander, in case the worst should happen tonight. The worst was not going to happen. It was a quiet evening, a barn roof, a careful man. But Henry was a man who left letters under inkstands. Alexander did not open it. After supper, he sat with Eleanor in the small parlour by the fire, and Beatrice on the rug played with a cloth doll. And at 8:30, Beatrice was carried upstairs by her mother and tucked into her own cot, which was now in Eleanor's room because of the leak. Eleanor came back down. She sat opposite the Duke. She had a glass of barley water. She had not opened her book. Alexander? Yes. She asked how many people in Ashbourne knew she was alive. None, he told her. She repeated the word back, soft, as though feeling for what it weighed. You've been formally a widow for 2 years and 3 months. Your name is on the chapel window. My household is in second mourning. My mother visits the chapel every Sunday. The tenants light a candle for you in the village church on the anniversary. There are letters of condolence from the Queen in a leather portfolio on my desk that I've never been able to bring myself to throw away. None of those people know. None of them will know until you tell them. Until I tell them. It is your story, Eleanor. It is not my story to tell. It is not even your story to tell yet, because you have not yet decided what story it is. When you decide, I will follow. She turned the glass in her hands. She watched the fire. My mother. Your mother is in Italy. She went out for her health in the year after the accident. She is at Bellagio with your aunt. She will be home in February. My father. Your father took the news harder than I did. He was taken in the autumn of the next year. He is in the churchyard at Lichfield, beside your grandmother, with a marble cross of his own choosing. She nodded. She had known the answer in her body, perhaps, before she had asked. She did not weep. She set the glass down. Alexander. Yes. When you take me to Ashbourne, if you take me to Ashbourne, I cannot walk into your hall and be told that I am a duchess and resume a life I do not remember. I cannot do it. I would break, and Beatrice would break, and you would have a woman in your house who looked like your wife and was no one. I need you to let me come slowly. I need you to let me arrive. You will arrive. How? He had thought about this for 2 days. He had thought about it in the south room at 4 a.m. He had thought about it in the orchard, walking. He had thought about it kneeling beside Beatrice's cot the night of the rain. He had a plan. He had had a plan in his pocket for a day and a half, and he had been waiting for her to ask. I will take a house in Brighton for the winter, he said. A small one. There is one on the Marine Parade that belongs to my uncle. It has 6 rooms, no estate, no tenants, no callers. I will tell my household at Ashbourne that I am travelling to the coast for my health, which is unimpeachable, because everyone in Ashbourne has been saying for 2 years that I do not look well. He paused. The fire popped quietly between them. Eleanor's hands had gone still in her lap, and the small movement of her shoulders that came of careful breathing was the only thing about her that moved. I will take Beatrice with me as my ward, for the moment, the daughter of a distant cousin. I will take you with me as Beatrice's governess. You will not be a duchess. You will be a Miss Anne Carrington, the cousin who has helped your cousin Henry raise a small girl. You will live in Brighton for 1 winter. You will walk on the front. You will hear the sea. You will see me in a small house by a small fire, with my coat off. And you will decide whether the man you see is a man you wish to remember. He drew the next breath more carefully than the one before. If he is, you will come to Ashbourne with me in the spring, and we will tell the truth in our own time. If he is not, if at any point in the winter the truth becomes too heavy, or my face becomes a face you cannot bear, you will tell me, and I will take you back to Henry, and I will release you. I will release you in writing. I will release you in front of witnesses. I will release Beatrice into your custody and give you the income of one of my Wiltshire estates for the rest of your life. You will be free. You will be Ellie of Carrington Hall. I will be a man who lost his wife twice. Eleanor had not moved while he spoke. She said, almost without sound, that he would do that. He confirmed it. She said the harder version of the same thing, that he would let her go. I would let you go, Eleanor. I would not enjoy it. I would not survive it well. But I have spent 2 years thinking you were lost to me, and I have spent 5 days learning that you are not lost, so much as not yet found. And I will not undo the second by behaving like the first. You will choose this time. You did not choose me 8 years ago. You accepted me, because your father liked me and because we made each other laugh. And that was enough then, and it was a great happiness, but it was not a choice. This time, you will choose. If you choose me, I will know what it is to be chosen. If you do not choose me, I will know that for 2 years I loved a woman who, when she was given the freedom of the world, walked another way. I would rather know the truth than keep a duchess who would rather have been Ellie of Carrington Hall. The fire popped. Eleanor looked at her hands. They were in her lap. They were not steady. She said the word back to him slowly. Brighton. As if testing the shape of it on her tongue. He confirmed it. With Beatrice, she said. With Beatrice, he answered. She was her daughter, and she would not be away from her for 1 hour. With him, she said, in the small house. He repeated it. And, after a longer pause, she asked about Henry. Henry will be at Carrington. He will come to dinner in Brighton on Sundays, if you wish. He will not come if you do not. He will write to you if you wish him to. He will not write if you do not. I will not ask Henry to disappear. I have not. I am beginning not to wish for Henry to disappear. But you will set the terms with Henry. I will set no terms about Henry. You are generous. I am terrified. She looked up. She gave a small, broken laugh. The first laugh he had heard from her that was not the laugh of a stranger. She said his name. He answered. Then, after a breath, she said only the one word. Yes. He asked what she meant by it, gently, so that she would say the rest in her own time. She did. Yes, Brighton, she said. Yes, the small house. Yes, the winter. Yes, Miss Anne Carrington. Yes, Beatrice as his ward. Yes. Yes. All of it. Yes. He did not move. He could not. After a moment, Eleanor stood, came around the small table between the chairs, and laid her gloved palm, bare-handed, in fact. She had taken off her glove without his noticing, and her palm was bare, against the side of his face. She held it there for the space of 3 breaths. She did not bend down. She did not kiss him. She did not speak. She held her bare palm to his face, and she watched his eyes. And after the 3rd breath, she said, I think I am beginning to know you. You are. It is not all back. It does not need to be. Alexander. Yes. She asked, almost in a whisper, whether the gesture, her hand on his face, was a thing she had done before. He told her it was. She asked when. When I had failed at something. When something in the house had gone wrong. When I had spoken in the upper house and the speech had been poorly received, and I had come home raw. You used to wait for me in the small library, and when I came in, you would do exactly this. Exactly this, Eleanor. You would put your bare palm against my cheek, and you would watch my eyes, and you would not say anything, and the failure would become smaller, because I would remember that it was not the only thing about me. I see. She did not take her hand away for another breath. Then she did. She returned to her chair. She picked up her glass. She drank the last of the barley water. She set the glass down. It is late. I will go up. Sleep well, Eleanor. Sleep well, Alexander. At the door, with her hand on the brass handle, she paused. I will speak to Henry tomorrow morning. Yes. You will let me speak to him alone? Of course. Thank you. The door closed. Alexander sat by the fire a long time. After a while he reached out, took Henry's folded letter from under the pewter inkstand on the dining table — the table was in the next room — and brought it back, and opened it, and read it. It was 4 pages long. It was dated, in Henry's neat hand, last Wednesday. It began, Dear Alexander, I have a thing to tell you that I should have told you 26 months ago. He read it twice. He folded it. He placed it on the mantel under a small Staffordshire dog. He went to bed at midnight, and he slept, for the first time in 2 years, for 7 uninterrupted hours. In the morning, Eleanor and Henry walked in the orchard for a long time. Alexander did not watch them through any window. He sat in the small library with Beatrice on his lap, and showed her how to draw an apple, badly, because he could not draw, and Beatrice corrected his apples with the firm hand of a child who knew her fruit. He drew a tree. He drew a horse. He drew, at Beatrice's insistence, a hen called Constance, which had to be brown, and which had to have its head turned to the left, because that was how Constance preferred to be regarded. The library clock struck 11. It struck the half. It struck 12. At 12, Beatrice was hungry, and Alexander walked her down to the kitchen, where Mrs. Druitt had set out a small plate of bread and butter, cut into the shape of soldiers. At 1:15, Eleanor and Henry came back into the house. Eleanor's eyes were red, but her face was set. Henry's face was the face of a man who had been wept on, and had absorbed it without flinching, and was now, in his own way, weeping inside, although nothing about his expression said so. They came to the small library together. Eleanor took Beatrice on her lap. Henry stood. He looked at the Duke. "I've been told," said Henry. "The plan." "Yes. It is a generous plan. It is the only plan I have. I would have preferred it had it been a less generous plan, because I would then know what to do with my face. I am sorry to inconvenience your face, Henry." Henry laughed once, hoarsely. "You may have her, Alexander, with my blessing, with my apology, with my old promise to her, kept at last. I will write to my sister at Northumberland tonight, and let her know that the widowed cousin she has been politely not asking about will be removing to Brighton for the winter. I will arrange the household. I will close the south wing. I will visit only when invited. I will not write, unless written to." "Henry." "Yes?" "You will be invited." Henry blinked. He nodded once. He turned away to the window and looked out into the orchard and breathed for a moment. And then he came back, and he reached out his hand, and he and Alexander shook hands across the desk, like two men closing a piece of business. Beatrice, on Eleanor's lap, looked from one to the other with grave approval. "Are we going on a journey?" she inquired. "We are going on a journey," said Eleanor. "To where?" "To Brighton." "What is Brighton?" "It is by the sea." "What is the sea?" There was a small pause. The three adults looked at one another. Then Henry said, gently, "The sea is what the river was, my love, after it had grown up." Beatrice considered this. She found it satisfactory. She returned to her bread. They left Carrington Hall on the morning of the 7th day, in a borrowed travelling carriage with Henry's coat of arms on the door, and 4 good horses in the traces. The leaves of the medlar were nearly all down. Mrs. Druitt, on the gravel path, kissed Eleanor on both cheeks, and then, after a moment of obvious internal debate, kissed Alexander on one. Henry handed Beatrice up into the carriage himself. The child solemnly informed him that he must come to Brighton when the rooks made their second nests, which, apparently, was a Beatrice calendar of unimpeachable accuracy. Eleanor leaned out of the window. She placed her gloved palm, very briefly, against Henry's cheek. "Henry." "Yes." "You did not take what you could have taken." "I know." "That was the gift, Henry. That was the gift. Not the keeping of me. The not taking." "Ellie." "I shall not call you Uncle from Brighton. I shall call you Henry. And Beatrice will call you Uncle Henry, because she is 3, and shall continue to do as she chooses for some years yet." "I should like that." "Goodbye, Henry." "Goodbye, Ellie." The carriage moved. The medlar fluttered. The gate did not this time complain. The gardener had oiled it that morning. Henry stood on the gravel with his hands behind his back until the carriage had cleared the bend in the upper road, and the last sound of harness had thinned out into the wind across the orchard. Then he turned, and he went back into the house, and he wrote 2 letters at his desk, one to his sister at Northumberland, and one to a roofer in Lewes about a slate. The small house on the Marine Parade had 6 rooms, a south-facing front parlour, a kitchen, 3 bedrooms upstairs, a small attic that smelled of tarred rope, and a cook called Mrs. Babcock, who had served the Duke's uncle for 30 years, and who, when she was told the rough outline of the situation by the Duke himself in his uncle's small library on the first afternoon, sat down very slowly on the chair the Duke had indicated, smoothed her apron, looked the Duke of Ashbourne in the eye, said only, "Right, Your Grace, we'll manage," and rose to put a kettle on. The winter that followed was the quietest winter of Alexander's life. He had thought, in the orchard at Carrington, that he understood what Eleanor was asking for when she asked to come slowly. He understood it less in Brighton, in the first week, than he had thought he would. He had imagined a winter of slow, deliberate courtship, small walks on the parade, quiet evenings, the careful return of intimacy. He got something less tidy than that. He got days when Eleanor was almost herself, days when she was almost a stranger, days when she sat in the front parlour with Beatrice on her lap, watching the sea, and did not speak to him for hours. Days when she came down at breakfast and was so familiar in her gestures, the way she set down her cup, the way she pushed her hair off her temple with the back of her wrist, the way she asked, without looking up, whether anyone had heard from the post, that he had to leave the room to compose himself. He had days when she remembered something all at once, and days when she remembered nothing for 3 or 4 days running, and then went quiet about it, ashamed, as if the absence of memory were a fault of hers. He had 2 evenings in November when she sat by the fire after Beatrice was abed, and wept for an hour without telling him why, and he sat across from her without touching her, and let her weep, because she had asked for that on the second night. He had a morning in December when she put her head against his shoulder in the kitchen, where Mrs. Babcock was rolling pastry, and said only, "I am tired, Alexander, but it is the good kind of tired now," and stood that way until Mrs. Babcock, without turning her head, said, "There's coffee on, Your Grace," and he understood that Mrs. Babcock had known, of course, from the first afternoon, exactly who Miss Anne Carrington was, and had not said one syllable about it to anyone, because that was Mrs. Babcock. By Christmas, Eleanor had remembered a great deal. She had not remembered everything. She had remembered her wedding morning, in pieces, the smell of the chapel, the names of her bridesmaids, the small black and white cat she had had as a girl. She had not remembered the night Beatrice was conceived, and she had told Alexander, frankly, sitting on the parapet of the Marine Parade in a black travelling cloak in the wind, that she did not think she would. Some things, she said, the head decided to give back, and some things it kept. She was not afraid any more. She had also not yet, in 12 weeks under his roof, slept in his bed. He had not asked her to. He waited. In late January, on a wet evening when Beatrice had been put to bed and Mrs. Babcock had gone home to her sister in Hove for the night, Eleanor came down to the front parlour in a plain cream wrapper over her nightgown, with her hair unpinned, and she stood in the doorway and she said, "Alexander." "Yes." "I have remembered the wedding journey. I have remembered the carriage. I have remembered the inn at Tunbridge. I have remembered the first night." "You have." "I think I should very much like, tonight, if you would like, to share your room." He set down the book he had been pretending to read. "I would like." "You will not. Alexander, you will not." "I will do exactly what you tell me to do, Eleanor. Tonight and any night. If you wish me only to put my arm around you in the dark and to sleep, I will only put my arm around you in the dark and sleep. If you wish anything else, you will say so, and I will follow. Thank you. You are my wife. I am beginning to be your wife again." "You are." She came to him then, in the doorway of the front parlour of the small house on the Marine Parade, and she put her bare hand against the side of his face, the way she had done in Henry's parlour 2 months earlier, and she held it there a long time, and he watched her eyes. At last she said, "I choose you, Alexander." He answered that she had chosen him. She corrected him, very gently, with the present tense, that she was choosing him, now, in this doorway, in this small parlour, in her stockinged feet. He said yes. She did not weep. She did not laugh. She did the thing she had done on her wedding morning, 8 years before this November, which she had remembered every day of the lost 2 years, and which she had not, until this evening, dared to expect to see again. She went up on her toes, 1/2 inch in her stockinged feet, and she rested her forehead very lightly against his. They stood that way for a long time. That night they shared a room. By the standard of the small house on the Marine Parade, nothing about that night was scandalous. By the standard of Alexander's 2 years of widowhood, it was a great mercy. He held his wife in the dark. He listened to her breathe. He did not weep. She did. He held her while she wept, without speaking, and he did not, even once, ask her whether she would remember it in the morning. By morning, she did. In March they returned to Ashbourne. They did not return as a duchess returning from beyond mourning. They returned in stages, with letters going ahead, and with Alexander's mother, who had been told in February by Alexander in person, in her drawing room, in 5 sentences of devastating simplicity, preparing the household. The dowager had wept for a full hour in her chair, and had then wiped her face, and had stood up, and had said only, "Right. The chapel window must come out at once. The almshouse name may stay. I shall write to the bishop tomorrow." The chapel window came out the week before Easter. The new window, a plain pale green, was put in by Whit Sunday. The almshouse kept Eleanor's name, because Eleanor, when she finally walked into the village at Ashbourne in May, in a deep green riding habit Alexander had not seen on her in 3 years, with Beatrice's hand in hers, said, quietly, on the doorstep of the almshouse, with the village postmistress staring at her over a hedge, "Leave it. It was kindly meant. Leave it." There was much that took time in the spring at Ashbourne. There was Eleanor's mother, who returned from Italy in March and met her daughter for the first time on the gravel path of the same house where she had once kissed her goodbye, and who did not speak for a quarter of an hour, and then knelt, at 62, on the gravel, in a Worth travelling dress that had not been intended for kneeling, and held both her daughter's hands, and could not, for some weeks, accept that the daughter was the daughter. There were the tenants, who had to be told, in small groups, by the rector and the duke. There was the rector himself, who had buried the empty coffin, and who had to be told before all of them. There was Beatrice, who had been Miss Beatrice Carrington in Brighton, and was now Lady Beatrice of Ashbourne, and who, at 3½ years old, took the change of name in her stride, and reported to Alexander, on her second day at Ashbourne, that the kitchen at the great house was not as nice as the one at Brighton, because Mrs. Babcock was not in it. There was Henry. Henry came in May, when he was asked. He came in a plain travelling coat, with a single valise and a horse, and a parcel of pickled walnuts from Mrs. Druitt for the dowager. He stayed 3 days. On the first day, he met the dowager, who studied him for some minutes through her lorgnette, and at the end said only, "You did not touch her." It was not a question. Henry inclined his head. The dowager held out her hand. He kissed it. They did not speak of it again. On the second day, Henry walked with Eleanor in the long alley of limes at the back of the park, in the same way they had walked at Carrington, only this time with Beatrice between them, kicking at the new leaves. On the third day, he and Alexander went out riding together, and they spoke of horses, and of the upper house, and of nothing else. At the end of the third day, Henry went home to Sussex. He was invited back at midsummer. He came. He was invited again in August. He came. He was invited at Christmas. He came. He arrived each time in the same plain coat, with the same valise, and he left after 3 or 4 days each time, with a small parcel from Mrs. Babcock, who eventually agreed, in June, to be promoted from Brighton to Ashbourne, with a substantial rise, and he resumed his quiet life at Carrington, where the slate above the nursery had been replaced, and the medlar tree had been pruned, and the brown hen called Constance had been replaced by a great grand hen called Constance II, who was identical in every respect. Henry did not marry. He was not unhappy. He had become, by some private, internal adjustment that none of his oldest friends would have predicted, a man at rest. He told Alexander once, over port, on a December night in the second year, that he had been afraid to let go of his love for Eleanor, because he had thought that without it, he would be empty, and that he had been pleasantly surprised to find, having let it go, that he was not empty so much as quieter. He was, he said, considering taking up the violin. Alexander, who had heard Henry sing in his youth, told him, without smiling, that the world was not ready for Sir Henry Carrington with a violin, and refilled his glass. A year and a half after their return to Ashbourne, on a slow afternoon in late October, the Duke of Ashbourne stood at the upper window of the long gallery and watched a travelling chaise come up the avenue. He had been told, that morning, to expect a visitor. He had asked his wife, at breakfast, if he might be the one to meet the visitor at the gate. His wife had laughed and said, "Yes, you ridiculous man. Of course you may meet him at the gate." He went down. He crossed the south lawn. He reached the iron gate of the lower garden at the same moment the chaise drew up at the carriage sweep. Sir Henry Carrington climbed down stiffly. He had been on the road since dawn, and looked up to see the Duke of Ashbourne on the inside of an iron gate that was open this time, swung wide, the hinges newly oiled. "Henry," said the Duke. "Alexander," said Sir Henry. Behind the Duke, on the gravel path, ran two figures. One was a small girl of nearly 5, in a sapphire coat, with chestnut curls and a wooden comb in her hair. She had not slowed down since the carriage had appeared on the avenue. She had been pacing the gallery for half an hour. She arrived at the gate at full speed and flung herself at Sir Henry Carrington's knees with the unrestrained joy of a child for whom 3 months without an uncle is exactly 2 months and 29 days longer than reasonable. "Uncle Henry." "Lady Beatrice." "You smell like leather. Mamma said you would." The other figure, walking, not running, because the Duchess of Ashbourne was now 7 months along with their second child and had been advised to walk, wore a deep ruby wool gown, buttoned to the throat against the October air, with her hair pinned simply at her nape, with the wooden comb's older sister, also chestnut-toned, also bought in Bath. She reached the gate. She laid her bare palm against Henry's cheek for exactly the length of 3 breaths. "Welcome to Ashbourne, Henry." He answered, with the dryness of an old joke between old friends, that he thanked her Grace. She corrected him to Ellie, and he repeated the name back to her, as he had been doing for nearly 2 years. The medlar tree, which had been transplanted from Carrington as a sapling the previous spring, and was now establishing itself by the south wall, gave a small, thin shiver in the autumn wind. The wood pigeon called. Beatrice, having satisfied herself that Uncle Henry was real and present, and had not been replaced by an inferior model, climbed the iron gate to sit on it, and announced to the world at large that supper would be at 6. Alexander put one hand at the small of his wife's back, very lightly, as he had been doing for a year and a half, and he stood with his oldest friend on either side of the gate, and he looked up at the great honey-stone front of Ashbourne, where his mother was waving from an upper window, and the dowager's 2 spaniels were barking, and a girl in a saffron pinafore, stained with crushed leaves, was being lifted down from the iron rail by her father. And he understood, not for the first time, but in a new way, that he had once thought he had lost everything, and that he had not, and that the second understanding was infinitely larger than the first. Eleanor's hand found his at the gate. She did not have to look at him. She knew where he would be. If you have ever sat in a quiet house, in the years after you thought you had lost what mattered most, and ever caught yourself doubting whether the world is the kind of place where lost things can come back, pull your chair closer to the fire. Sit a little longer with me. Tell me in the comments which moment held you tonight. The gate, the wedding silk, the rain on the nursery roof, the bare palm in Henry's parlour. Subscribe so the next story finds you. And if you remembered, while you listened, somebody you have not yet forgiven, or somebody who has not yet been able to forgive themselves, write to them tomorrow. The medlars are not over for 10 days. There is time.